She stepped off that train with nothing but a carpet bag and a look in her eyes that said she'd already survived the worst life had to offer. He was supposed to feel relieved. Instead, standing in that frozen Wyoming station with snow cutting sideways across his face, Caleb Mercer felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years of living alone on the frontier, something cold and sharp and completely separate from the weather. Fear. Not of the blizzard rolling in behind her. Not of the wolves he'd been hearing at the tree line for weeks. Fear that this woman, this stranger he'd written 3 desperate letters to, was about to look at everything he had built and decide it wasn't worth staying for. He was probably right, but he was also wrong in every way that mattered. This is the story of 2 broken people who found each other at the edge of the wilderness, and what it cost them to stay. Watch until the end. Hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train was 40 minutes late. Caleb Mercer knew this because he had been standing on the platform since 2:30 in the afternoon, and the cold had worked its way through his wool coat, through his flannel shirt, through the thermal undershirt his mother had sent him 3 Christmases ago before she stopped sending things altogether. He could feel it in his teeth now. That particular brand of Wyoming December cold that didn't ask permission, it just moved in, settled into your bones, and reminded you that this territory had been here long before you arrived and would be here long after you were gone. He stamped his boots against the wooden planks. Checked the sky. The clouds to the northwest had turned the color of a bruise. That was bad. That was the kind of sky that preceded the storms the old-timers talked about, the ones that buried homesteads up to their rooflines, that froze cattle standing in their pastures, that turned a man who wandered 20 feet from his own front door into a statistic nobody would find until spring. Caleb had lived through 2 of those storms alone. He was not eager for a third. A third he could probably survive. That wasn't what scared him. What scared him, though he would not have used that word, not out loud, not to anyone, was the particular quality of silence that followed those storms. The way the world went completely still under all that white. The way the cabin walls seemed to press inward. The way he'd once spent 6 days without speaking a single word to another living soul and hadn't noticed until the 7th day, when he'd tried to say something to his horse and his voice had come out rough and cracked, like a door that hadn't been opened in too long. He was 31 years old. He had 14 cattle, 1 horse, a dog named Soot, who'd gone deaf sometime around last February, and a 160-acre ranch that he'd spent 3 years building out of raw Wyoming wilderness. He had no one to leave it to. That was why he'd written the letters. He had not told anyone about the advertisement, not Pete Halverson at the general store in Rawlins, not the Dunbar brothers who ran cattle on the ridge 2 valleys over, and certainly not his neighbor, Margaret Foss, who was 73 years old and had opinions about everything, and would have had opinions about this that Caleb did not want to hear. He'd found the agency in the back pages of a newspaper that had blown against his fence post last September. The kind of advertisement that a man only noticed when he was lonely enough to look for it. Matrimonial arrangements for frontier settlers. Discretion guaranteed. Write to us. He had written 3 drafts before he sent the letter. The first 2 he'd burned in the fireplace because they read like a man asking to be pitied, which was not what he wanted to be and not what he was. The third he'd kept short and plain. My name is Caleb Mercer. I am 31. I run cattle in Wyoming. I have a house and land and no debt. I'm not always easy to live with, but I'm not a cruel man. I'm looking for a woman who wants a real life, not a comfortable one. He hadn't expected an answer. He'd gotten one 6 weeks later, in an envelope with a return address from a post office in Ohio. Dear Mr. Mercer, I don't have much in the way of background to recommend me, and I won't pretend otherwise. I'm 27. I've worked as a seamstress, a laundress, and for 2 years as a cook at a boarding house in Columbus until it closed. I have no family to speak of, and no particular attachment to Ohio. I've been told I'm stubborn, and that I don't know when to stop working. I don't consider either of those things a fault. I'm not looking for comfort either. I'm looking for something that's mine. If that's the kind of woman you're after, write back. Nora Whitaker. He'd read that letter 4 times the night it arrived. Then he'd folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of his writing table where he kept things he didn't want to lose. He'd written back the same night. 3 more letters had followed. Nothing romantic. They weren't that kind of people. Neither of them. Just information, traded back and forth. what the ranch looked like, what the winters were like, what he expected and what he didn't. She'd written back with equal plainness, telling him what she knew how to do and what she didn't, what she was willing to learn, and what she refused to put up with. The fourth letter had ended with, "I'll be on the December 22nd train. Don't send anyone else to meet me." And here he was. The whistle reached him before the smoke did, a long, low sound that rolled across the frozen flats and disappeared into the gray sky. Caleb straightened up, adjusted his hat, and felt an absurd and undignified urge to check whether his coat was buttoned straight. He did not check his coat. He was not that kind of man. The train came in slowly, brakes shrieking against the cold rails, great billows of steam rising and immediately flattened by the wind. It was a small train, just the engine, a cargo car, and 2 passenger carriages. Bitter Creek wasn't a destination. It was a stop between destinations, the kind of place where the conductor announced the name without looking up from whatever he was reading. 3 people got off. The first was an older man Caleb didn't recognize, carrying 2 large cases and moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees hurt. He disappeared around the side of the station without looking at anyone. The second was a boy, maybe 12, who jumped off the steps before the conductor could stop him, and then stood on the platform looking around with bright, excited eyes, until a woman Caleb had never seen before rushed up from the other end of the platform and grabbed his arm. The third was Nora Whitaker. He knew it was her before she'd finished stepping down. He couldn't have explained exactly why, except that she moved differently than people who were arriving somewhere expected. She moved like someone who'd learned a long time ago not to assume she was welcome. She was medium height, dark-haired under a gray traveling hat that had seen better years, wearing a wool coat that was practical but thin. She carried a single carpet bag in her right hand. She stepped onto the platform and stopped, and she looked around with calm, steady eyes. Not nervous, not excited, just assessing. The way you looked at a place when you were trying to figure out what it was going to cost you. Then her eyes found him. He realized he'd been staring like an idiot. He walked toward her. "Miss Whitaker?" he said. His voice came out fine, which was a relief. She looked at him directly. Her eyes were gray-green, the kind of color that shifted depending on the light. Right now, in the flat winter afternoon, they were closer to gray. There were tired lines around them that her letters hadn't mentioned. "Mr. Mercer," she said. They stood there for a moment, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it wasn't the horrible awkwardness he'd been dreading either. It was just 2 strangers standing on a train platform in the middle of winter, trying to figure out where to start. "That all you have?" he asked, nodding toward the carpet bag. "That's all I have," she said. No apology in it, no embarrassment. He nodded. "Train was late. Storm's coming in from the northwest. We should move." "All right." He reached out for the bag. She didn't hand it over immediately. Just for a moment, her grip tightened on the handle, and he saw it. The smallest hesitation. Then she let him take it. It weighed almost nothing. They walked to the wagon without speaking. The ride back to the ranch took an hour and 40 minutes in good weather. In good weather. The wind had picked up by the time they left the station, and the sky to the northwest had gone from bruised to nearly black. Soot, riding in the back of the wagon with his nose working furiously at the new smell, kept looking northwest and then back at Caleb with an expression that, had it come from a person, would have been called deeply unhappy. Nora sat beside him on the wagon seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the country go by. It was not pretty country. Not in December. The cottonwoods along the creek bed were stripped bare and gray, their branches clawing at the sky like something trying to get out of the ground. The grass was brown and beaten flat. There was old snow in the low spots, not fresh, clean snow, but the gray-brown crust of snow that had frozen and melted and frozen again until it looked more like rock than water. The mountains were there somewhere to the southwest, but the clouds had swallowed them. Caleb had stopped seeing this landscape a long time ago. It was just the view from his wagon. But he found himself watching Nora watch it, trying to read her face. Her expression didn't change. "It's not like Ohio," he said, because he felt like he should say something. "No," she agreed. "It's not. Spring's different. Summer, too. It opens up." She glanced at him sidelong. "You don't need to sell it to me, Mr. Mercer. I'm already here." That caught him off guard. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." A minute passed. The wind gusted hard enough to rock the wagon seat. "The storm," she said. "How bad?" Don't know yet. Could blow through fast. Could sit for days. He paused. I've got enough firewood split to last 2 weeks. Enough food for maybe 10 days if we're careful. Livestock's the concern. How many head? 14 cattle. 1 horse, that's Winston. He nodded toward the big gray pulling the wagon. And Soot back there. She turned to look at Soot, who had positioned himself as close to her end of the wagon as he could get, and was now attempting to sniff her shoulder without her noticing. She noticed. He's deaf, Caleb said. Don't let him fool you into thinking he's helpless. He's just old. Nora reached back and scratched the dog behind one ear without making a production of it. Soot closed his eyes with the specific ecstasy of very old dogs receiving any kind of attention. My letters didn't mention everything about the ranch, Caleb said, and he heard something in his own voice, a careful quality, like he was walking toward something that might give way. I should tell you, the house is small, 1 main room, 1 bedroom. I've been sleeping in the main room. That'll stay that way until... He stopped, started again. I'm not expecting anything from you, not yet. Not until you've decided this is what you want. She was quiet for a moment. I read your letters 3 times each, she said finally. You wrote clearly. I knew what I was coming to. Most people think they know. I'm not most people. He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the road, her chin level, her jaw set with a kind of quiet stubbornness that he recognized from her letters, and that he found, to his own surprise, genuinely reassuring. No, he said. I don't suppose you are. The ranch appeared through the cottonwoods as the light was starting to fail. Caleb had tried over the past month to see it the way a stranger would see it. The cabin was solid. He'd built it himself over 2 summers, thinking all along about doing it right, using good timber from up the ridge and quarried stone for the fireplace. The barn was larger than the house, which was probably telling, and it listed very slightly to the east from last winter's ice load. There were fence lines running off in 2 directions, mostly intact. A root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin, its door reinforced with iron strapping. It was not a beautiful place. It was a functional place. There was a difference. Nora looked at it the same way she'd looked at the landscape, calm, measured, taking it in. The barn leans, she said. East. I know. I'll fix it in spring. Root cellar's well placed. Gets sun in the morning, stays cool in the afternoon. She nodded slowly. Is there a kitchen garden? South side of the cabin. Nothing in it now. He paused. I don't know much about gardens. I do, she said. Not bragging, just information. He pulled the wagon up to the barn and set the brake. They both climbed down, and he showed her where to stand while he brought Winston in out of the cold. She watched the process with focused attention, not hovering, not asking questions, just learning the layout of the barn, where things were kept, how everything fit together. When he came back out, she was looking at the sky. That storm's close, she said. He came and stood beside her and looked northwest. She was right. The black edge of it was maybe 2 hours out, maybe less. The air had that particular electric stillness that preceded bad weather. Even the wind had gone quiet for a moment, like it was taking a breath. Come inside, he said. I'll get a fire going. The inside of the cabin was a reasonable representation of 3 years of a man living alone. It was clean, which surprised her. She could tell by the slight shift in her expression when she walked in. He had cleaned it the previous week in preparation, partly because he had some basic dignity and partly because he'd been genuinely afraid of what she'd think. He had, in the cleaning process, discovered things that suggested his cleaning habits during the months prior had been somewhat casual. There was a stone fireplace against the west wall, big enough to cook on and heat the room simultaneously. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, one newer than the other. He'd made the second chair a month ago, specifically. A bookshelf with maybe 30 books, mixed between practical volumes on cattle and carpentry, and a handful of novels that he never mentioned to anyone. 2 oil lamps, a braided rug, somewhat flattened from use. The bedroom door stood open, showing a neatly made bed with a quilt that his mother had sent him before the letters stopped. He started the fire while she set her carpetbag down and stood in the center of the room, looking around carefully. You made the furniture, she said. It wasn't a question. Most of it. Chair over there. He nodded toward the better of the 2. That one's newer. She understood that immediately. He could tell by the way she pressed her lips together, not with pity, just acknowledgement. It's good work, she said. The joinery. I had time. He got the fire going and straightened up, and they stood in the small cabin with the cold still seeping out of the stone walls and looked at each other with the slightly terrible awareness that this was their actual life now, that the letters were done, and the train ride was done, and the wagon ride was done, and this small room, this silence, this uncertainty was what they'd both chosen. I'll cook, she said. What do you have? And just like that, they moved into it. She made something out of dried beans, salt pork, and a small onion that had gone slightly soft but was still usable. She did it efficiently, without complaint, without asking him where things were twice. She found the pot, found the salt, found the way to work the damper on the fireplace without him explaining it, and she cooked while he checked the livestock, reinforced the barn door against the coming storm, and brought in enough firewood to stack beside the fireplace in 3 tall rows. He came back in stamping snow off his boots. It had started, light but purposeful, to find her laying 2 bowls on the table and pulling the newer chair toward the side closer to the fire. Sit, she said, nodding at the newer chair. That one's yours. She looked at him. I made the food. You hauled wood in a blizzard. Sit. He sat. She sat across from him and they ate, and the food was plain but it was warm, and there was something about eating a hot meal across from another person after a certain amount of time eating alone that Caleb hadn't been prepared for. It felt heavier than he'd expected, in a good way that was also slightly unbearable. Tell me about the cattle, she said. So he did. He told her about the herd, the ones he'd lost last winter, the bull he was planning to sell in spring, the 2 cows that were going to calve in February if he'd timed things right. She asked practical questions, feed stores, water sources, whether the creek froze completely or just near the banks. She absorbed the information in the steady, unsentimental way she seemed to approach everything. Outside, the snow had stopped being light and purposeful. It had become something else. It's picking up, she said without looking at the window. She'd heard it. Yes. What's the plan if it gets bad? Every 3 hours through the night, someone goes to check the barn. Make sure the animals are covered, the water troughs haven't frozen solid, that nothing's come down under the weight of snow. She nodded. I'll take the midnight run. He looked at her across the table. You're going to need to sleep at some point, she said. So will I. We split it. He thought about arguing. He was used to arguing with himself about these things, weighing the practical against the proud, the sensible against the stubborn. Alone, his stubborn usually won because there was nobody to disagree with. All right, he said. After supper, she washed the bowls while he banked the fire for the evening and checked that the shutters were properly latched. The wind by now was a steady roar, not gusting, not occasional, but a continuous, committed sound that meant the storm had fully arrived and intended to stay. She was standing by the fireplace drying her hands on a cloth when he turned around from the window. The bedroom's yours, he said. I'll sleep out here. She nodded. No argument, no false protest. Wake me at midnight. I will. She picked up her carpet bag and walked to the bedroom door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. Caleb, she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name. The letters had been formal, Mr. Mercer and Miss Whitaker, and it had stayed that way all day through the wagon ride and the supper. He looked at her. I don't know if this is going to work, she said. Her voice was the same as it had been all evening, steady, direct. But there was something underneath it now, something that she wasn't hiding exactly, but wasn't advertising either. I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I might be. I thought I was when I wrote to you. She paused. I just want you to know that I'm not going to pretend if I'm not. He held her gaze. He thought about several things he could have said, including several things that would have been reassuring and false. I know, he said. I'm not either. She nodded once. Then she went into the bedroom and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. Caleb Mercer stood in his small cabin and listened to the storm screaming outside and looked at the narrow strip of firelight showing under the bedroom door and felt something shift inside his chest. Not quite hope, not quite fear. Something new that didn't have a word yet. He went to his bedroll by the fire, lay down, and listened to the wind. He did not sleep for a long time. Ian. She was awake before he came to wake her. He could hear her moving in the bedroom at 11:30, and by midnight, when he rapped on the door frame, she was already dressed in her coat and boots. "How is it?" she asked. "Bad," he said simply. He had just come in from the 10 o'clock check. His coat was crusted with ice at the shoulders. "Winds may be 40 miles an hour. Visibility's about 10 feet. She looked at him steadily. "Show me the rope." He had a system, a length of heavy rope tied from the cabin door to the barn door, strung along 2 fence posts in between, so that even in zero visibility you could follow it hand over hand and not wander off into the dark and the cold and not come back. He showed her the attachment on the doorpost. He showed her the knot. "Keep both hands on it," he said. "Don't let go for any reason. If you go down, you get back up and you keep hold of the rope. You don't let go." "I understand. The troughs are on the right side of the barn when you go in. The cattle are—" "I'll figure out the cattle," she said. "Go sleep." He stood in the doorway. Because he should go sleep, she was right. He needed to sleep, and watched her take hold of the rope and lean into the wind and disappear into the white dark. He didn't sleep. He stood in the doorway with the cold pouring in around him, until 6 minutes later the rope went slack in the way that meant she'd reached the barn and could let it go. He counted the minutes. 8 minutes inside. Then the rope went taut again. She was coming back. When she came through the door, her hat was gone, blown away somewhere in the dark, and her hair was completely white with driven snow. She was blinking against the ice crystals on her eyelashes. "Animals are fine," she said, pulling the door shut behind her. "Water troughs have a crust, but I broke it. One of the cows is standing funny, favoring her right front leg. I'll check her again at 3. "That'd be Bess," he said. "She does that when she's cold. It's not structural." "Good to know." She was pulling ice off her coat sleeves, matter of fact about it. "Go sleep, Caleb. I'll wake you at 3. He wanted to say something. He wasn't sure what. He went to his bedroll. He was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke him at 3, as promised. He took the 3 o'clock run and the 6 o'clock. When he came back from the 6 o'clock run, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. A gray-white glow that wasn't exactly dawn yet, just the storm deciding to let in a little light. She was at the fireplace when he came in, making coffee from the tin on the shelf. She'd found it without asking, and she handed him a cup before he'd gotten his coat off. It was too hot. He didn't care. He wrapped both hands around it and stood by the fire and felt the heat work its way back into his fingers. "Storm's not done," he said. "No," she agreed. She was looking out the window. There was a clear patch about an inch wide at the edge where the shutter hadn't fully latched, at the white nothing outside. "But it's not getting worse." He drank the coffee. She drank hers. The fire cracked and popped. "You didn't sleep," he said. He could see it in her face, the particular flatness around the eyes that came from a night without rest. "I slept some," she said. "Not much." She didn't argue with that. "I wanted to make sure the cow was all right at 3. And then at 4:30 I heard something outside that I thought might be wolves. It wasn't." He went still. "What was it?" "One through the fence post. Different pitch." She met his eyes. "I know what wolves sound like, Caleb. I grew up with a brother who thought it was funny to teach little girls which sounds were dangerous." He looked at her, the gray-green eyes, the snow-raw cheeks, the hair that had dried wild from last night's blizzard. There was tiredness in her face and something else under it, something held steady by will rather than ease. "There are wolves," he said. "I've been hearing them at the tree line for 3 weeks." She nodded. "Tell me about them." So he told her. About the pack. 5 or 6 animals, he thought, never close enough to count properly. About the previous winter when they'd taken 2 calves before he'd been able to drive them back with rifle fire. About the way they tested the perimeter of the ranch when the weather got bad, when the elk and deer went to lower ground and the easy food disappeared. She listened with the same focused attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she said, "Where's the other rifle?" He blinked. "I have 1 rifle." She looked at him for a moment. "You have 14 cattle and a wolf pack at your tree line and 1 rifle." "I've managed." "Alone," she said. "You managed alone." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "We should talk to the Halverson man you mentioned, after the storm. See if he's got something he can spare or sell cheap." He realized he was smiling, just slightly, and he stopped it before it got away from him. but it had been there. Pete's got a Winchester he's been trying to get rid of for 2 years, he said. I always told him I didn't need it. Tell him you changed your mind. I'll tell him. The storm kept them mostly inside for the rest of that day. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it, him handling the barn runs, her managing the food and the fire, and a list of repairs she found that needed doing inside the cabin. She was not a woman who sat. He'd gather that from the letters, but seeing it was different. She patched a boot that had cracked along the sole using a bit of leather and adhesive she'd found in a tin in his supply box. She found a pot with a slow drip and fixed it using a method involving solder that he hadn't known was possible. She sorted through his food supplies with the systematic efficiency of someone who had thought about hunger before and didn't intend to let it happen to her again. Late in the afternoon, she found his books. He came in from the barn to find her standing at the shelf, her head tilted sideways to read the spines. He stopped in the doorway. You can look at them, he said. She turned. I didn't ask. I know you didn't. She held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the shelf. Her finger moved along the spines. She stopped at one, pulled it out. It was a battered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, in the original English translation, the binding held together with a length of twine. You've read this, she said. Twice. Good? She was looking at the first page. Better the second time. She put it back carefully. Her finger moved on and stopped at something else. 2 years before the mast. She pulled that one out. Can I borrow this? He looked at her. There was something slightly off about the question, the slight formality of it, the can I borrow, as if she were a visitor in someone else's house and had to ask permission for everything. He thought about that for a moment. Nora, he said, you live here. She stilled, just slightly. Then she looked at the book in her hand, and something in her face shifted, barely visible, but there, like a door opening a crack. Right, she said quietly. I do. She sat down in her chair with the book. He went to put on dry socks. The storm rattled the shutters. The fire burned. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was something. By the time they ate supper again, beans again, with some dried beef she'd found in the supply box and added, the wind had dropped from a roar to a howl, which was still bad, but directionally better. 3 days, he said, looking at the northwest corner of the ceiling the way a rancher looked at weather. Maybe 4, then it breaks. The cattle can hold that long? If I can keep getting to the barn. He paused. The snow's piling on the north side of the barn. If it gets much deeper, I'll lose the door. She was quiet for a moment. Then we dig it out tomorrow morning. I said I will lose the... I heard what you said, she told him, with the particular patience of someone talking to a person who hadn't caught up yet. We dig it out, both of us. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. Her chin was at that angle again, the one that had been in every letter, that he'd somehow been able to hear in the words without seeing it. I'm not helpless, Caleb, she said. I know you don't think I am, but I need you to stop acting like I might be. He thought about that. He thought about the midnight barn run, the wolf question, the boot repair, the pot, the way she'd been awake at 3 a.m. watching and listening. You're right, he said. I'll stop. She nodded once. That was that. After supper, she took the dishes to wash, and he sat at the table with his hands around his coffee mug and looked at the fire and thought about the fact that it had been, by any reasonable measure, a brutal day. Storm, fear, exhaustion, the particular strain of being around a stranger in a small space. And it had been less quiet than any day in recent memory. Not comfortable, not easy, but less quiet. He wasn't ready to call that a good thing. He wasn't ready to call it anything, but it was something he noticed, the way you noticed a change in weather or a shift in the quality of light, something his body registered before his mind had caught up to it. She handed him a dry bowl to put away. Their hands didn't touch. She went back to the washing. He put the bowl on the shelf. Outside, the storm kept screaming. Inside, the fire burned. They both went to bed without saying much, and they both lay awake for a long time, separately, on opposite sides of a thin wooden door. But in the morning, when Caleb opened that door to start the day, there were 2 cups of coffee already sitting on the table. And that, small as it was a beginning. The storm had not finished with them. Neither had the wilderness. and neither, it turned out, had they finished with each other. The second morning started the same as the first had ended, with coffee already on the table when Caleb came through the bedroom door, and Nora already dressed, already moving, already 3 steps ahead of the day before it had fully begun. He didn't comment on the coffee. She didn't make anything of it. That was how it worked between them. Things happened, got noticed, got filed away without ceremony. He was starting to understand that this was her particular language. Not words. Actions, placed quietly where they'd be found. He drank his coffee standing up, looking out through the crack in the shutter at the world outside. It was worse. The snow had come up nearly to the window ledge overnight. The barn, which sat 40 feet northeast of the cabin, was barely visible through the white. Just a dark shape in all that gray-white nothing, like something seen through frosted glass. The rope line was still there, strung tight between its posts, disappearing into the blur. "North door?" Nora asked from behind him. She meant the barn door, the one he'd been worried about. "Can't see it from here." He set down his cup. "I need to go check." "I know, I'm coming." He turned. She was pulling on her second pair of wool socks, layering them over the first pair, the way someone did when they'd thought through cold weather and taken it seriously. She'd found one of his old scarves, a long gray one that had been hanging on a peg by the door since before he could remember, and wrapped it around her neck twice. He thought about telling her to stay inside again. He remembered what she'd said the night before. He put on his coat without saying anything. They went out together. The cold hit like a physical thing, not a temperature, but a force, a wall that pushed back against every step. The wind had dropped from the previous night's roar to something lower and meaner, a sustained pressure that found every gap in their clothing and worked its way through. Caleb took hold of the rope, and Nora grabbed it behind him, and they moved hand over hand through the white, not talking, heads down. The north barn door had 3 feet of packed snow against it. Caleb stopped when he saw it, and Nora pulled up alongside him, and they both stood for a moment looking at it with the resigned assessment of people who already knew what the next 2 hours were going to look like. "Shovels?" she said. "Back wall of the barn, left side." They went in through the east door, which still had clearance, and got the shovels, and they dug. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was just work, cold and heavy and repetitive, the kind that made your lower back start complaining after about 20 minutes, and didn't stop complaining after that. The snow was dense and packed and kept shifting as new wind pushed more of it against the wall. For every 3 shovelfuls they cleared, another one seemed to replace it. Nora worked without talking, which Caleb appreciated. He'd known people who narrated their effort, who said things like, "This is really something," and "Wow, it just keeps coming," as if the comment made the work lighter. She didn't do that. She just shoveled. An hour and 40 minutes later, the door could open. They went back inside without celebrating it. The cattle were all right, nervous, close packed in the center of the barn in the instinctive way that herd animals collected under pressure, but fed and watered and alive. Caleb checked Bess's leg, which was still favoring but no worse than the night before. He topped up the feed. Nora broke the ice crust on all 3 water troughs without being asked. They came back to the cabin in better shape than they'd left it, which was the best you could say for mornings like this. She made oatmeal. He split the last of the indoor firewood and stacked it. They ate across from each other, and the silence was a different quality than it had been 2 mornings ago. Not uncomfortable exactly, but careful, like 2 people still learning the distance between them. Then Nora stood up to carry her bowl to the wash basin, and her right foot came down wrong on the edge of the braided rug where it had folded back, and her ankle rolled with a sharp, ugly crack, and she went down hard. She didn't scream. She made a single short sound, something between a gasp and a curse, and grabbed the table edge on the way down, which kept her from hitting the floor completely. She ended up half sitting against the table leg, her right boot on the floor at a wrong angle, her face white. Caleb was around the table in 3 steps. "Don't move." "I'm not moving," she said through her teeth. "Can you feel it?" "I can feel it," she said. That meant it wasn't numb. That was something. "It's not broken." She said it like she was willing it to be true. "You don't know that yet." "I know what broken feels like." That stopped him for a moment. There was a whole history in that sentence that he didn't have access to, and this was not the time to ask about it. He unlaced her boot carefully. She sat very still, jaw tight, not making sounds, and eased it off. Her ankle was already swelling, a puffy, tender-looking swell that turned the joint thick and wrong. "It's a bad sprain," he said. "Is it broken?" He pressed along the bone carefully, watching her face. She didn't flinch at the right places. "I don't think so, but you're not walking on it today." She looked at him with an expression that he was going to come to recognize over the months that followed, a kind of fierce internal argument that she was losing against her own body, and knew it. "The barn. I'll handle the barn. You can't do the 3-hour runs alone all night. Nora." His voice came out quieter than he'd intended. "I've been doing it alone for 3 years. I can manage tonight." She looked at him. He looked at her. They both knew the difference between one night of barn runs in a bad storm and 2 days, or 3, with the weather the way it was. He was 41 years old. No, 31. But 3 years of frontier winters had a way of adding to the count. He was tired already, and the storm wasn't done. Neither of them said that out loud. He helped her to the chair by the fire, propped her foot on the extra wood block, wrapped the ankle in a strip of clean cloth from the supply tin. She sat and let him do it without arguing, which told him how much it hurt. "I'm sorry," she said, when he was tying off the wrap. He looked up. "For what?" "For being—" She gestured at herself, the wrapped ankle, the chair. "This. You tripped on a rug," he said. "I've had that rug folded back in that corner for 2 years. That's my fault, not yours." She didn't look entirely convinced. He understood it. She'd come here to work, had been very clear in her letters and in the previous 2 days about what she was here for, and now the storm was getting worse, and she was sitting in a chair with a wrapped ankle watching him prepare to do everything alone. He understood how that felt. He'd had a horse throw him 3 springs back and broken 2 ribs, and had to spend a week largely immobile watching his fences blow over, and the helplessness had been worse than the pain. "Tell me what you need from the supply stores," she said. "I can organize from here. Take inventory. Figure out what we have, what we need, what we can spare. You don't have to cut—" "Caleb." The same patient tone as the night before. "Let me be useful." He let her be useful. She spent the rest of the morning at the table with the supply ledger he'd kept sporadically, and her own careful handwriting filling in the gaps, cataloging everything in the root cellar and the cabin stores: dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, potatoes, 2 tins of preserved tomatoes, a small amount of sugar, coffee, salt, lamp oil, medicinal supplies. She had a clear head for numbers and for the kind of practical arithmetic that translated food into days. By midday, she'd laid out a ration plan on a sheet of paper that was tighter than what he'd have done and more likely to see them through to the end of the week. "We're short on lamp oil," she said when he came back in from the noon barn run, ice in his beard, moving carefully. 3 days at current use, maybe 4 if we're conservative." He pulled off his gloves. His hands had that deep, aching cold that took a while to come back from. "I've got 2 more tins in the root cellar. Back corner, top shelf." She made a note. "That's better. Still, candles is backup." "Tin on the bedroom shelf. About a dozen." "Good." She looked at her paper. Then she looked at him. "You're exhausted." "I'm fine." "You've done 4 barn runs in 12 hours in a full storm." "I've done worse." "That's not the reassurance you think it is," she said. He sat down across from her at the table and rubbed his face with both hands, which was as close as he was going to come to admitting she might have a point. His shoulders ached, his back ached. The cold had settled in behind his eyes in a way that suggested he was running on fumes and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. "Sleep," she said. 2 hours. I'll wake you for the 3 o'clock run." "You can't do the run?" "I know I can't do the run," she said with careful patience. "I'll wake you for the run. There's a difference." He looked at her. She looked back, her gray-green eyes steady, that particular stillness in her face that he'd been noticing, the kind that came from practice, from long habit of holding yourself together when things were difficult, from learning very young not to fall apart when falling apart wouldn't help. He wondered, not for the first time, what her life in Ohio had actually looked like. The letters had been practical and spare, and he'd respected that. But there were things in the spaces between the sentences that he'd noticed without understanding. That business about knowing what broken felt like, for instance. The way she treated every task like something she had to prove she could do. The way she'd looked at the cabin when she'd arrived, not the house itself but at him, measuring him for something. He didn't ask, not yet. That was the kind of conversation that needed to be arrived at, not forced. 2 hours, he said. He went to his bedroll, lay down with his coat still half on, and was unconscious in about 40 seconds. She woke him precisely 2 hours later by saying his name once, quietly, from the other side of the room. She'd been reading the 2 years before the mast, and had put it down to time him, and she handed him a cup of water and said, "Wind's dropped a little, still bad, temperature's worse." He went out. This was how the second day went. He did the runs. She managed everything else: the fire, the food, the supplies, the practical architecture of survival inside the four walls. They were not in each other's way, which was something he hadn't expected and genuinely appreciated. He'd lived alone long enough to develop strong feelings about his space, where things went, how the fire was banked, what order the morning happened in. She moved through all of it with a careful attention that meant she disrupted nothing without reason. She also had opinions, which she stated plainly. Too much wood on the fire was wasteful. The beans needed more salt. The supply ledger had a category error in the way he'd been recording lamp oil consumption that she'd corrected. He didn't argue. She was right about all of it. That evening, after supper, they sat by the fire, and the exhaustion had worked its way past defenses on both sides. And the conversation went somewhere it hadn't gone before. "You said in your second letter that you worked at a boarding house," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire. 2 years, you said." "That's right." "What happened to it?" A pause. "Owner died. His son came out from Philadelphia to settle the estate. Decided the boarding house wasn't worth the trouble." Another pause. The people who worked there, had 2 weeks' notice. That happened twice to me," he said. "Before Wyoming. Working somebody else's land, somebody else's cattle. You build something up, and then it turns out it was never yours." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came out here?" "Partly." He shifted his weight. The fire popped. "Partly I just needed to see if I could do it. Build something from nothing, whether it was mine to hold." And he looked around the small cabin, the fire, the stacked wood, the careful ration list in her handwriting on the table. "I'm still finding out." She turned her coffee cup around in her hands, a slow, thoughtful movement. "I left Ohio because I was invisible there," she said. "That sounds like a strange thing to say about a place you've lived most of your life, but that's what it was. I could have stayed and gotten quieter and smaller until there was nothing left." She looked at the fire. "I didn't want to disappear." He didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have diminished it. He just sat with it, and she sat with it, and the fire burned between them. Outside, a sound rose and fell underneath the wind. They both went still at the same moment. It came again, low and distant and unmistakable, even through the storm. Wolves. Caleb was up and at the rifle on the wall before Nora spoke. "How close?" she asked. Her voice was steady. No panic, just the question. "Other side of the creek, I think." He stood at the window, trying to see through the shutter crack. Nothing, just white dark and snow moving sideways. "They're not at the barn yet. Will they come in weather like this?" "They're hungry," he said. "Hungry enough? They'll come in anything." The howling rose again, closer than before, and then dropped away into the storm. Soot was on his feet in the corner, stiff-legged, his deaf old ears laid flat against his head, despite the fact that he couldn't hear the wolves. He could feel them somehow. Vibration, pressure, something that ran through the floor. The dog stared at the door with the fixed, purposeful intensity of an animal that had survived long enough to know when something bad was close. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. He checked the rifle, loaded, as always. "I'll do the next run early. Check the perimeter." "Be careful," Nora said, simple and direct, the way she said everything. He looked back at her from the door. She was still in her chair by the fire, her wrapped ankle propped up, her face lit from one side by firelight. There were lines of fatigue around her eyes and a tightness in her jaw from hurting all day without complaining about it. She looked like what she was, a woman who had come somewhere completely new and difficult and was holding herself together through it by will. She looked like someone who deserved better luck than she'd been getting. "I will," he said. He went out into the dark. The wolves were to the northwest, close to the tree line, and he could see the shapes of them moving when lightning strobed briefly across the frozen valley. Low silhouettes, more of them than he'd thought, circling somewhere near the fence. He fired once into the air, a sharp sound that cracked across the valley, and the shapes scattered. But they didn't go far. He stood in the knee-deep snow at the fence line for a long moment, listening to the storm and looking into the dark where the shapes had been. And he thought about the cattle in the barn, and about the rifle in his hands, and about Nora Whitaker sitting by the fire with a wrapped ankle, and the thing he'd felt on the train platform, that specific new fear, came back and settled in his chest like it had found a place to stay. He went back inside. She was asleep in the chair, her chin dropped to her chest, the book open on her lap. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her, not the way a man looked at a woman he wanted, not yet, but the way a man looked at something that had become important to him before he'd fully understood it was happening. He put another log on the fire. He took the book carefully from her lap and put it on the table without waking her. Then he sat down across from her and waited out the night. The storm broke on the fourth morning. Caleb knew it before he opened his eyes. There was a quality to the silence that was different from the silence inside a storm. Inside a storm, even when the wind dropped briefly, there was still pressure, still the sense of something coiled and waiting. This silence was empty in a different way, finished. He sat up from his bedroll and looked at the window. A thin line of actual sunlight, pale and cold and winter-thin but real, cut through the shutter crack and laid itself across the floor in a way it hadn't in 4 days. Nora was already awake. She was at the table with her coffee, her wrapped ankle propped on the wood block, looking at the ledger sheet. She looked up when he moved. "It stopped," she said. "Yeah." He pulled on his boots and coat and went outside. The world was white and broken and completely still. The snow had come up past the lower fence rails on the north side, chest-high drifts in some places, sculpted into hard, windswept ridges that caught the thin morning light and threw it back in small, cold sparks. 3 fence posts on the east line had gone down entirely, pushed over by the accumulated weight. The cottonwoods along the creek were bent and burdened, some of them split at the trunk where ice had gotten into old wounds and pried them open. He stood on the cabin step and looked at all of it and made a slow inventory in his head. The fences he'd expected, the downed trees he'd expected. The east pasture was going to need a week of work at minimum before it could hold cattle again. Then he looked toward the back pasture and his stomach dropped. 3 of the cattle were down, not wolves, no blood, no signs of struggle, just the particular stillness of animals that had gotten too cold and hadn't gotten up again. He walked out there through knee-deep snow, knowing what he was going to find, and found it. 3 of his 14 head gone overnight. He stood beside the nearest one, a 3-year-old roan he'd been planning to breed in spring, and felt the dull, specific grief of a man watching his livelihood die in increments. He wasn't going to get through the day if he let himself feel all of it right now. He filed it away, the way you filed things that hurt on the frontier, and went back to the barn to check the remaining 11. 8 in the barn, all alive. 3 in the back pasture that he hadn't been able to get into the barn before the storm hit, and those 3 were the ones who hadn't made it. The math was what it was. Winston was fine. Soot, who had apparently spent the worst of the storm in the corner of the barn with an expression of profound indignation, came out to meet him with stiff-legged dignity and promptly fell over in a snowdrift, which broke the mood slightly. Caleb pulled the old dog out of the drift, set him back on his feet, and went back to tell Nora. She took it the same way she took most things, quietly, with the immediate pivot toward what came next. "The herd that's left," she said. "Are they healthy?" "Seem to be, shaken, need to eat. Then we feed them." She was already pushing herself up from the chair. "Help me get my boot on." Her ankle was better than the day before, but not good. The swelling had gone down enough to get the boot on, which she insisted on despite the fact that he could see the wince she was trying not to show when she put weight on it. She was not going to sit inside today. He knew that. He didn't waste breath arguing it. They spent the morning doing the hard, unglamorous work of storm recovery. Caleb broke trail to the collapsed fence sections while Nora, moving carefully with a stripped branch as a walking stick, redistributed the hay stores and checked the cattle for injuries. She found one, a young steer that had a deep cut on its left shoulder, probably from a fence splinter during the storm. She cleaned it with the medicinal supplies she'd cataloged 2 days ago, her movements careful and practiced, and packed it with a poultice she made from something in the tin that Caleb didn't know the name of. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, watching from the barn door. "The boarding house owner's wife," she said, not looking up. "She was from Tennessee, knew about 100 things like this." A pause. I paid attention. He thought about that, about Nora Whitaker at 25, working in someone else's house, learning everything she could from the people around her because she already understood that knowledge was the only thing that was reliably yours. Nobody could take away what you knew how to do. By midday, they'd done what could be done. The immediate emergencies were handled. The remaining cattle were fed and watered. The broken fence sections were noted. The materials needed listed. The 3 dead cattle were a loss he'd have to absorb somewhere in the spring accounting, and there was nothing to do about that now except move forward. They came back to the cabin, and she made soup from the last of the salt pork and some of the preserved tomatoes while he worked on resetting a fence post near the barn. It was good to work in daylight for the first time in days, to see what he was doing, to feel the cold as just cold rather than as a weapon. The sun stayed low and pale, but it was there, and the valley, buried and broken as it was, had a particular hard beauty to it in the aftermath of the storm that he'd seen before and never quite got used to. He was back inside, washing his hands, when Nora said, "Tell me something." He turned from the wash basin. She was stirring the soup, her back to him. "Tell you what?" "Anything." She paused. "I've been talking at you about practical things for 4 days. Tell me something that isn't practical." He dried his hands on the cloth and thought about it. This was not his natural mode. He was a practical man, had always been a practical man, had come to value practicality specifically because feelings were the kind of thing that got you in trouble if you let them take up too much space. But she'd asked, and she wasn't the kind of person who asked for things she didn't mean. "When I was 23, he said, "I worked a cattle drive up from Texas. 8 weeks. Worst summer of my life in most ways, like heat, dust, a trail boss who was genuinely the meanest man I've ever known." He paused. "Last night of the drive, we came over a ridge above the Platte River at dusk, and the river had flooded and the whole valley was just this sheet of orange water catching the sunset. Looked like the whole world was on fire, but in a good way." He stopped. "I've never seen anything that looked like that since. Sometimes I think I made it up." She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned around with the spoon in her hand, and there was something in her face. Not softness, exactly, but the thing that came just before it. "You didn't make it up," she said. They ate soup. The afternoon came in cold and clear, and Caleb went out to start on the east fence line while the light held. He worked steadily, resetting posts, running wire, thinking about spring and cattle and what the ranch was going to need. Normal thoughts. Working thoughts. He was so absorbed in them that he almost didn't notice when the light changed. He straightened up from the fence post and looked toward the tree line to the northwest, and his hands went still. The wolves were out. Not at night, not under cover of storm. In broad afternoon daylight, which meant something had changed, something had shifted in the calculation they made between hunger and risk. He could see them clearly now for the first time. 5 of them, big animals, gray-brown against the snow, moving along the far tree line with the loose, purposeful gait of predators that had made a decision. They weren't running. They were circling. He counted the distance to the cabin. About 300 yards. The barn, closer. The cattle in the south pasture, which he'd let out this morning for the first time in 4 days, were maybe 150 yards from the nearest wolf, and they knew it. They'd bunched themselves into the far corner of the pasture fence, pressing against each other, not moving. Caleb had 1 rifle. He was 300 yards from the cabin. He started walking back, fast, keeping his eyes on the wolves. They hadn't fixed on him yet. They were focused on the cattle. 2 of the 5 had broken from the tree line and were moving across the open snow toward the pasture fence in that diagonal, testing way that meant they were still deciding but leaning toward committed. He was maybe 150 yards from the cabin when the lead wolf hit the pasture fence and the cattle broke, not away from him, toward the barn, the way he'd trained them to move under pressure, and the barn door was open, which was the only thing that worked in his favor. The cattle poured through it in a panicked rush, and the wolves pulled up short at the fence, momentarily confused by the sudden absence of prey. Caleb reached the cabin and grabbed the rifle from inside the door. He came back out and fired once in the air. The sharp crack rolled across the valley, and the wolves scattered, 3 of them back toward the tree line, 2 of them simply stopping, standing in the open snow, watching him with that flat yellow patience that wolves had when they were serious. Those 2 didn't run. He fired again. One of the standing wolves flinched but didn't move. The other sat down. Caleb had been around enough wolves to know that a wolf that sat down when you fired at it was not a wolf that was going to leave on its own. He was reloading when he heard the cabin door. He didn't turn around because he couldn't take his eyes off the wolves, but he heard the door, heard the particular creak it made, heard footsteps in the snow behind him. "Nora," he said, "go back inside." "No," she said, from about 10 feet to his right. He looked. She was standing in the snow in her coat and boots, her wrapped ankle taking her weight unevenly, with the axe handle in both hands, which was not ideal, but was better than nothing. "That's an axe handle," he said. "I know what it is." She was looking at the wolves. "How many?" "2 right here, 3 back at the tree line, I think." "You have 1 shot loaded." "Working on 2. Work faster." He loaded. She stood her ground beside him, which was both completely impractical and, in the way that mattered right now, exactly what was needed. There was something about 2 people standing in the same line that changed the geometry. The wolves read it. He could see them reading it, the sitting one standing back up, both of them doing that flickering lateral eye movement that meant they were recalculating. "Back up slowly," he said, "toward the barn." "You back up," she said. "I'll match you." They moved together, step by step, toward the barn. The wolves advanced the same number of steps. One of the 3 at the tree line had started moving back toward the open ground, drawn by the cattle smell from the barn. "They're not going to stop," she said. Her voice was completely steady. He didn't know how. "I know." "So what's the plan?" "I'm going to have to shoot one." "Do it then." "If I miss, don't miss," she said. He didn't have an answer for that. He raised the rifle, found the nearer of the 2 front wolves in the sights. Big male, maybe 100 yards, standing broadside. His hands were cold, and he was tired in a way that went all the way down to the middle of his bones, and the wolf was moving, slightly, testing, and this needed to be right. He fired. The wolf dropped. The other 4 were gone in seconds, back into the trees, fast and low, the way they went when the calculation flipped from possible to not worth it. The valley went completely quiet except for the nervous sounds of cattle from the barn and the sound of Caleb's own breathing. He lowered the rifle. Nora was still standing beside him, both hands on the axe handle, looking at the tree line. After a moment, she let out a long, slow breath that she'd been holding, and he saw her shoulders come down from where they'd been. "Good shot," she said. "I told you not to come out." "You did," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked back at him, chin level, no apology in it, and this time he didn't even try to stop the feeling that moved through him, something warmer and more complicated than relief, something that sat in his chest right next to the fear and didn't feel entirely separate from it. "Your ankle," he said. She looked down at her foot, and the adrenaline must have been fading because he watched her face change slightly, a tightening around the eyes. "It's fine." "It's not. It'll hold until we get inside." It held until just inside the barn door, which was as far as she made it before her legs simply decided it was done. She didn't fall. She caught the door frame and stopped herself, but she couldn't hide the way her face went gray. He was beside her in 1 step. He got his arm around her, and she let him take her weight without arguing, which told him everything about how much it actually hurt. "I've got you," he said. She didn't answer that, but she held on. He got her back to the cabin and to the chair by the fire. He re-examined the ankle. She'd re-injured it, set the healing back. The swelling had returned worse than this morning. He re-wrapped it tighter. She sat with her jaw set and let him. When he tied off the wrap, she was looking at the fire with that expression she'd had on the second morning. The internal argument, the losing side. "You're angry," he said. "I'm not angry at you." "I know. Are you angry at yourself?" A long pause. The fire cracked. "I made it worse," she said. "I came out there, and I didn't help. And I made it worse." He looked at her. He thought about the way she'd stood beside him in the snow, steady, not making a sound, watching the wolves with those gray-green eyes like she'd face down anything that moved toward what was hers. He thought about how the wolves had read it. 2 people, not 1. "You helped," he said. "I had an axe handle. Nora." He waited until she looked at him. "You helped." She held his gaze. Something passed across her face, a slow shift, like ice beginning to give in spring, still solid but changed underneath. "Does it still hurt?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "No pretending, not this time." "Then stay off it," he said. "I mean it this time, for real." She looked like she was going to argue. Then she looked at her ankle and at the rifle he'd leaned against the wall, and at the dog who had appeared from somewhere and was now pressing his heavy old body against her leg with the instinct of deaf animals everywhere that something needed comfort. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. He stoked the fire. She scratched soot behind the ears. Outside, the valley was quiet. No wind, no wolves, just the cold, clean silence of a winter afternoon after a storm had passed. The land looked like something recovered from a long sickness, battered and pale and stripped down, but still here. The 2 of them, sitting together in the warmth of that small cabin, were beginning to understand that they were still here too. 3 days passed after the wolves. They were not easy days. Well, nothing about this place and this season was easy. But they were different from the days before. The emergency quality had lifted, the way pressure lifted after a fever broke. What was left was the ordinary difficulty of the frontier in December, which was still considerable but manageable. Known. The kind of hard that didn't surprise you. Caleb worked the east fence line in the mornings while the light was best, resetting posts, restringing wire, working his way section by section through the damage the storm had done. It was cold, steady work that left his hands stiff by midday and his back complaining by afternoon. But there was satisfaction in it. The particular satisfaction of a man fixing something that was his to fix. He could see the progress. That mattered. Nora stayed mostly off the ankle as he'd asked, which cost her. He could see what it cost her every time he went out and she stayed in. That particular restlessness of a person whose natural state was motion. She managed it the way she managed most things, by redirecting it. She went through the cabin the way a person went through a house they'd decided to take seriously. Not cleaning exactly, but reorganizing, tightening, finding the inefficiencies that had accumulated over 3 years of a man living alone and not having anyone to point them out. The supply shelf got reorganized so that the things used most often were at the front. The firewood stack inside got rebuilt from the way he'd always done it, haphazard, into a tight interlocked structure that took up less space and pulled from the bottom rather than the top and burned more evenly. He came in one afternoon and stood looking at it. "That's not how I stack wood," he said. "I know," she said. She was sitting at the table mending a tear in one of his flannel shirts, the needle moving in small, even stitches. "Your way wastes about a quarter of the space." He looked at the stack. It was, objectively, better. "You could have asked. Would you have let me change it?" He thought about that honestly. "Probably not." "That's why I didn't ask," she said, and went back to the stitching. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the wood stack, and felt something move through him that was somewhere between exasperation and something warmer that he didn't have a name for yet. He took off his coat and sat down across from her without saying anything else. That was how most of their conversations went now, practical on the surface, something else underneath, both of them circling the underneath thing without quite landing on it. He'd catch himself watching her hands when she worked, the way they moved with that same quiet competence she brought to everything. She'd catch him watching and not look away herself, just hold the look for a moment before going back to whatever she'd been doing. Neither of them said anything about it. Not yet. There was a sense, on both sides, of something that needed to be approached carefully. Not because it was fragile, but because it was the opposite of fragile. And that was its own kind of intimidating. Christmas Eve arrived with a sky so clear and pale it looked like the inside of a shell, and a cold that was sharp but not cruel, the kind of December cold that felt almost clean after the brutality of the storm. The mountains were visible for the first time in over a week, white and enormous to the southwest, and the valley below them glittered with fresh-packed snow that caught the low sun and turned it into something close to beautiful. Nora stood at the cabin window for a long time that morning, looking at the mountains. "I didn't know it looked like that," she said. Caleb was at the table with his coffee. "The storm keeps them hidden most of the time this season." "They're enormous." She said it the way someone said something they'd thought they understood and then discovered they hadn't. "The letters didn't. I couldn't picture it." Most people can't until they're standing in front of it. She turned from the window. There was something in her face, not quite happiness, because she wasn't a person who wore happiness easily, but something adjacent to it, an openness she didn't always let show. "It's a good place," she said, quietly, like she was telling herself as much as him. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She went to make breakfast, and he sat with his coffee and let the moment settle. Later that morning, while Nora worked on the mending pile she'd accumulated from a week of ignoring non-essential tasks, Caleb rode Winston out to check the remaining cattle in the south pasture. The 11 survivors of the storm were moving better now, grazing on what grass showed through the thinner snow in the sheltered corner of the valley, their breath rising in small clouds. He counted them twice, checked their condition, and let himself feel something like relief at the fact that they were upright and eating and recognizably themselves. He was on his way back when he passed the root cellar and stopped. He sat on Winston for a moment, looking at the root cellar door, and thought about a thing he'd been thinking about for 2 days without letting himself think about it directly. Then he dismounted, tied Winston to the fence, and went in. The root cellar was cold enough to keep things preserved, but not cold enough to freeze, kept at that specific temperature by the hillside on 3 sides and the morning sun on the door. Nora had reorganized this too, he noticed, the same way she'd reorganized the cabin, everything logical, everything accessible. On the top shelf of the back wall, exactly where he'd told her the extra lamp oil was, sat the 2 tins she'd noted in the supply ledger. But he wasn't here for lamp oil. In the back corner, behind the potato crate, was a flat wooden box he'd put there the previous spring. He pulled it out and looked at it, and then he opened it and looked at what was inside for a long time. He put the box under his arm and went back to the cabin. Nora looked up when he came in, noted the box, and asked nothing. She had a quality he'd come to appreciate more each day. The ability to let things come at their own pace, to not push, to trust that if something was meant to be said, it would get said without being forced out. "I need to do something in the barn," he said, which was not entirely a lie. He did need to check on the steer with the shoulder wound. "I'll be back before supper." "I'll have food ready," she said, and went back to the mending. He spent 2 hours in the barn. Part of it was the steer. Wound healing well, no signs of fever. Another few days, and it would be right. The rest of it was the thing he'd been working on in his head for 2 days, the careful arrangement of words that never came out on paper the way they sounded in his mind, the clumsy, insufficient translation of something real into language. He also, and he would not have admitted this to anyone ever, practiced saying it out loud twice, in the privacy of the barn, while Winston looked on with the enormous dignity of horses who have witnessed human foolishness and decided it's beneath comment. Both times it came out badly. He went back inside. Nora had made the food, dried beef and beans again, which they were both tired of but neither complained about because there were limited options, and complaining about food didn't change what was available. She'd found something in the back of the supply box, though, a small tin of molasses, half full, that he'd forgotten was there. She'd made a pan of cornbread with it that was sitting on the edge of the fireplace, and the smell of it hit him when he opened the door and did something uncomplicated and good to the evening before it had fully started. She had also done something to the cabin. It took him a moment to see it because he'd been looking at the table, but when he looked up, there were pine branches on the window ledge, and above the fireplace, cut from the lower branches of the big ponderosa near the root cellar. Just pine branches, nothing decorative, but they were green against all that gray and brown cabin interior, and they smelled clean, and the cabin felt different for having them there in a way he couldn't fully account for. "Pine," he said. "I needed air," she said from the fireplace, turning the cornbread. The walk to the tree was manageable. "Your ankle is fine," she said. I walked slow. "Don't make it a thing." He looked at the pine branches, then at the table, where she'd put the 2 candles from the bedroom tin in the center in small holders fashioned from split wood, already lit, casting doubled light across the table surface. "Nora," he said. "I know it's not much," she said, with a practicality in her voice that was covering something else. But it's Christmas Eve. I didn't want to just not notice it. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at this woman who had come off a train 12 days ago with nothing but a carpet bag and had, in the middle of a disaster, found a way to make a home out of something that had only been a house. "It's good," he said. "It's really good." She turned then, and he could see that the practicality had shifted. Something had come up through it, something she hadn't completely locked back down. "Sit down," she said. "Food's ready." They ate by candlelight with the pine smell in the room and the fire behind them, and it was the first meal in 12 days that hadn't felt like fuel intake. It felt like a meal. The cornbread was good. The molasses gave it a depth that plain cornbread didn't have, and they ate 2 pieces each and said very little. But the silence was the warm kind, the kind that didn't need filling. After, she was washing the dishes when he went to his coat, which he'd hung on the peg by the door, and took the wooden box out of the inner pocket where he'd put it before supper. He sat down at the table and set the box in front of him and looked at it, and thought about the 2 attempts in the barn and how neither of them had been right, and decided that the right way was probably the honest way, which was to just say the thing plainly and not try to dress it up. "Nora," he said, "come sit down." She came to the table, drying her hands, and sat across from him. She looked at the box and then at him. "What is that?" He pushed the box across the table. She looked at him once more before she opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper. She took it out carefully and unfolded it. He watched her read it, watched her eyes move across the lines, watched her go still. It was the property deed. The ranch. 160 acres of Wyoming territory, registered in the name of Caleb J. Mercer, but he had added a line, written it in, above his name, in his plain, unpracticed handwriting, and Nora Whitaker Mercer, equal co-owner by her own right. She read it twice. She didn't look up. I haven't... She stopped, started again. "We're not married." "Not yet," he said. She looked up then. "I'm not doing this because I need someone to split the work," he said. "I'm not doing this because the winter scared me or because I owe you something. I'm doing this because..." He stopped, and the 2 attempts in the barn were useless to him now. The practiced sentences gone. And what was left was just the plain thing. "Because 12 days ago I was dying in here. Not from cold or wolves or anything you can name. I was disappearing, getting smaller every year, getting quieter, and telling myself it was just what this life was." He looked at his hands on the table. "And then you stepped off that train, and you fixed my wood stack without asking, and you stood in the snow with an axe handle against 5 wolves, and you didn't disappear, not once." She was very still across the table. "I'm not asking because it's Christmas Eve," he said. "I'm asking because I'm 31 years old, and I've built something real here, and I want to build the rest of it with someone specific. With you. Not out of desperation, not because it's practical." He looked at her. "Because when I went out to the tree line after the wolves left, I was afraid. And I've been afraid of a lot of things out here. Cold, injury, losing the herd. I've never been afraid of losing a person before." He paused. "I don't want to stop being afraid of losing you. That makes sense to me even if it doesn't make sense." The candles burned. The fire behind them was steady and low. Outside, the Wyoming night was full of cold stars and absolute quiet. Nora looked at the deed in her hands for a long time. He waited. He'd waited before. For cattle to move, for weather to change, for ground to thaw. And he knew how to sit with a thing without forcing it. "I'm not easy," she said finally. "I know that. I'll tell you when you're wrong. I'm counting on it. I have..." She stopped, looked at the deed again, at her name in his handwriting above his. "I have things I haven't told you from before. Things that aren't... They're not simple." "You don't have to tell me tonight," he said, "or any particular night. When you're ready." She looked up at him. The candlelight was doing things to her face, catching the lines around her eyes, the tiredness that was still there from 12 hard days, and underneath it something that had been tightening for all those 12 days and was now, slowly, letting go. "In Columbus," she said, like she'd decided something, "there was a man. I was going to marry him. I was 24. She looked at the table. He left, not dramatically. There was no argument, no scene. He just decided I wasn't worth the trouble of staying for. She said it flatly, The way you said things that had hurt badly enough and long enough ago that you'd run out of ways to feel about them. I spent 3 years being very careful after that about what I let myself want. Caleb looked at her. He thought about being very careful for 3 years. He understood that specifically. I'm asking you to be less careful, he said. I know that's not a small thing. She pressed her lips together. Her fingers were on the edge of the folded deed, not quite holding it. You really wrote my name on it. I did. Before I said yes. Yes. Why? He thought about it. Because it's yours whether you say yes or not. Because you've already earned it. The rest, he nodded toward the paper. The rest is just asking if you want to stay. The fire shifted and settled. Soot, who had been asleep in his corner, lifted his head and looked at both of them with the serene incomprehension of very old dogs, then put his head back down. Nora folded the deed closed. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she looked at him across the candlelit table. This rough, quiet man who had built a chair for her before she arrived, and written her name on his land before she agreed to stay, and something crossed her face that he'd never seen there before. Not happiness exactly, but the very beginning of it. Yes, she said. I want to stay. He let out a breath he'd been holding for, it felt like 3 years. Yes, he said. She turned the deed over in her hands and then, without warning, laughed. A short, slightly disbelieving sound, like something that had surprised her on the way out. He hadn't heard her laugh before. It did something to the room. You practiced that in the barn, she said. He looked at her. How did you... I saw you talking to Winston on the way back, she said, through the window. She was still almost smiling, which was the most open he'd ever seen her. Was it better than what you actually said? Significantly, he said. She laughed again, quieter this time, and shook her head. Outside, the night was cold and clear and perfectly still. Not the silence of a storm, not the silence of a man alone, but the silence of a valley that had come through something difficult and was resting in the aftermath of it, waiting for what came next. Inside the small cabin, 2 people sat across from each other at a candlelit table with pine branches on the window ledge and a property deed between them that had 2 names on it. And the hard part wasn't over. The winter wasn't over. The work wasn't over. Nothing about this place was ever fully over. But something had shifted underneath all of it. Something had, for the first time, been decided. They married on Christmas morning at the Foss homestead, 2 miles east along the creek road. It had been Nora's idea to go to Margaret Foss, and Caleb had agreed without argument, partly because he couldn't think of a better option, and partly because he'd spent 12 days watching this woman make good decisions under pressure and had started to trust that instinct. Margaret was the closest thing to a fixed point in this valley, 73 years old, the widow of the man who'd settled this particular stretch of Wyoming before anyone else had thought to, and possessed of the kind of authority that came not from title or wealth, but from simply having outlasted everything the frontier had thrown at her. She had opinions about everything, as Caleb had told Nora. She had opinions about the mail order arrangement. He was fairly certain, and he was fairly certain he didn't want to hear them. What he hadn't anticipated was that Margaret Foss, upon opening her door on Christmas morning to find Caleb Mercer standing on her step with a woman she'd never met, and a request he'd never made of anyone, would simply step back from the door and say, "Well, come in then. I'll put water on." Margaret's son-in-law, a quiet Swedish farmer named Arvid, who had married her daughter 10 years ago and operated with the particular diplomatic skill of a man who had lived with Margaret Foss for a decade, stood as witness. Margaret herself presided with the practiced authority of a woman who had attended many more frontier arrangements than official ceremony would have covered. There was no minister. There was no church. There was a warm kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and coffee, 2 people standing beside Margaret's fireplace, and words spoken plainly and meant entirely. Caleb had not prepared anything to say. He had thought, on the wagon ride over, about whether the occasion required something formal, something that matched the weight of what it was. He had decided against it, and when the moment came and Margaret looked at him and said, "Well, Caleb, say what you mean," he understood he'd been right. "I mean to take care of what's yours and build something worth handing down," he said. "I mean to tell you the truth when I know it and admit when I don't. I mean to still be standing next to you when this valley is unrecognizable from what it is now." He paused. I'm not good at most things that aren't practical, but I'm reliable. And I'm yours, if you'll have me." Nora looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said, "I came here with nothing, and I intend to leave it with something that matters. I don't know everything about you yet, and you don't know everything about me, and I think that's all right. What I know is enough." She glanced down briefly. The self-consciousness of someone not used to speaking in front of even 3 people, and then back up. "I'm not easy, and I already told you that. But I don't leave. That's the thing about me that matters most. I don't leave." Margaret nodded once, with the approval of a woman who'd heard a great many vows and could tell the difference between the ones that would hold and the ones that wouldn't. Arvid looked out the window with a discreet expression that might have been moved if Swedes showed that sort of thing. They rode back to the ranch in the clear Christmas morning, with the mountains white and enormous to the southwest, and the valley spreading out below them in the winter sun, and it was cold enough to make their breath visible, and neither of them talked much on the way back. But it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that came after something real, not before it. Winter did not care that they were married. January arrived with the specific cruelty of Wyoming January, temperatures that went down to numbers that didn't seem like they should be possible. A week of wind that stripped the snow from the ridges and piled it in the low places in 8-foot walls. 2 more cattle lost to a cold snap that arrived faster than Caleb had been able to prepare for. He rode out in the dark on a Tuesday morning to find them down in the east pasture and stood in the cold looking at them for a long time, doing the math in his head, subtracting from what he'd started with, and arriving at numbers that were going to make spring very difficult. He came back inside and told Nora. She listened. She looked at the ledger she'd been maintaining since the first week. The careful columns of what they had, what they'd spent, what they'd need. She was quiet for a moment, which meant she was thinking, not shutting down. "The Halverson place," she said. "You said Pete has been talking about selling off part of his herd for 2 years. He's not going to give them away." "I'm not asking him to give them away. I'm asking how much he wants and whether we have anything worth trading." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a line. "We have the bull. You said last fall you were going to sell him in spring. What if you sell him now and use that toward 2 or 3 heifers from Pete?" He looked at the ledger. He thought about the bull. A good animal, solid genetics, the kind of stock that usually brought a decent price in spring when buyers were restocked and flush. In January, in winter, the price would be lower. But lower than spring's price was still better than nothing, and 2 or 3 heifers now gave them breeding stock for the year and something to show for the season. "Pete's going to drive a hard bargain," he said. "Then we drive harder," she said. They went to the Halverson place that Saturday. Pete Halverson was a broad, red-faced man of 50 who had been ranching in this valley for 20 years and considered himself something of an authority on its workings and on the capabilities of everyone in it. He'd known Caleb for 3 years and had formed opinions about him that were not uncharitable but were firmly fixed. The appearance of Nora on Caleb's wagon seat adjusted those opinions in real time in ways he was visibly trying to process. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, when Caleb introduced her, with the particular care of a man choosing words. "Mr. Halverson," she said, "I understand you have heifers to move and we have a bull worth having. Let's not waste each other's time." Pete blinked. Then he laughed, a big, genuine sound, and looked at Caleb with an expression that said several things at once, most of which Caleb chose not to acknowledge. "Come inside then," Pete said. "My wife will have coffee." They came out 2 hours later with 3 heifers, one of which was already bred, at a price that was better than fair. Nora had done most of the negotiating. Caleb had contributed 2 critical moments. Once when Pete had pushed too hard on price, and Caleb had gone quiet in a way that Pete recognized as final. And once at the end when the deal was close and he'd offered to throw in 2 days of fence work in spring, which settled it. On the ride home with the 3 heifers trailing behind the wagon, Nora sat with her hands in her lap and watched the road. "That went well," he said. "It went fine," she said. "He wanted to sell. We wanted to buy." Most negotiations are just 2 people figuring out that they already agree. He looked at her. "Where did you learn to negotiate?" She considered that. "The boarding house. The owner's wife kept the books and dealt with the suppliers. I watched for 2 years. A pause. "She was the one who taught me. About a lot of things." Another pause. "She died the same year the boarding house closed, 2 months before." He let that sit. There was a whole chapter of grief in those two sentences. The specific cruelty of losing someone and then losing the place associated with them in close succession. He understood it differently than he might have 2 months ago, before Wyoming had shown him what it felt like to be afraid of losing a specific person. "What was her name?" he asked. Nora looked at him. It was not the question she'd expected. "Clara," she said. "Clara Marsh. She sounds like she was worth knowing." Nora was quiet for a moment. "She was," she said. "She was the most capable woman I've ever met. She made everything look manageable, even when it wasn't." She stopped, then quieter. "I've been trying to be like her since I was 22. He thought about Nora with the axe handle in the snow. Nora at the supply ledger. Nora reorganizing the firewood stack, fixing the leaking pot, making cornbread from almost nothing on Christmas Eve. He thought about the toll it took, trying every day to be sufficient, to be enough, to hold every practical thing together by will alone. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "That's the whole point of this." She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was coming in low from the southwest, lighting the side of her face, and she had an expression he'd been seeing more of recently. Not quite open, but closer to it than she'd been in December. Like a door that had been locked for a long time and had started to be left ajar. "I know," she said. "I'm getting used to it." The 3 heifers settled into the herd without incident. The bred one, a blocky red animal they would later name Agnes on account of her expression, turned out to be further along than Pete had let on. A detail that Nora noted in the ledger with a small, annotated comment that said simply, "Halverson knew." Still worth it. And delivered her calf in late February, 3 weeks ahead of what Caleb had calculated. He came in from the barn at 5 in the morning on a Thursday in February, stamping snow off his boots, and said, "Calf's down, doing well. Agnes is a good mother." Nora was already at the fireplace. She turned around. "Boy or girl?" "Girl." She nodded slowly, and the almost smile was there again. The one that had started appearing with more regularity since Christmas, that still surprised him every time. "Good," she said. "Girls are harder." He sat down at the table. He was cold and tired and had been up since 3, but there was something moving in him that the cold and tiredness couldn't fully cover. A low, steady warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. He'd been feeling it more and more as the weeks passed, this specific sensation of things accumulating in the right direction. Small things mostly. A new calf, a fence that held. Nora across the table in the morning. The particular sound of her voice when she was solving a problem out loud, thinking through it, turning it over. He hadn't said anything about it. There was a part of him, the 3 years of silence, the accumulated habit of keeping things inside because there was nobody to tell them to, that still defaulted to quiet. But it was less than it had been. It was getting smaller. February turned to March with more storms, smaller ones, the kind that arrived and spent themselves in a day or two and left the world a little more battered and then moved on. Caleb worked through them, maintaining and repairing, and Nora's ankle healed properly through February, and by March she was moving without the slight hesitation she'd carried since the fall on the rug, which she refused to discuss as any kind of victory, but which he noticed. They developed routines. Not the careful, negotiated routines of 2 people being polite to each other, but the organic, sometimes irritating routines of 2 people who had stopped performing and started just living. She made coffee in the morning and left his on the table. He'd stopped telling her she didn't have to because it had become simply a fact of the morning, like the sun coming up. He checked the barn last thing each night and came back to report on the cattle before either of them slept. A nightly accounting that had no particular purpose except that she wanted to know, and he'd started wanting to tell her. They argued. Not seriously, not about important things, but with the specific friction of 2 stubborn people occupying the same space and having different ideas about how certain things should work. He thought the morning barn run should happen before breakfast. She thought it was irrational to do sustained physical work in the cold before eating, and she was probably right, but he'd always done it before breakfast, and his body didn't want to change. They compromised. He went out for a quick check before eating and a full run after. Neither of them called it a compromise. They just started doing it. She thought the seed for the kitchen garden should go in 2 weeks earlier than he'd been planning. He thought she was underestimating how late the last frost could come this far north. They argued about it for 3 days in March, both citing reasoning that was legitimate, until Pete Halverson happened to mention during a supply run that his wife had always put in the garden the first week of April and never lost a crop. And Nora's timing was essentially Pete's wife's timing, and Caleb spent approximately 24 hours not mentioning this before finally saying, "You were right about the garden." Nora looked up from the ledger. "I know," she said, and went back to the ledger. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he went outside because that was the only reasonable response. She was at the door 30 seconds later. "Caleb?" He turned. "Thank you for saying it," she said. Simple, direct, no performance in it. He nodded. He went back inside. She held the door for him. That was most of their arguments. Sharp, pointed, resolved. There was one that wasn't. In the middle of March, a letter arrived from Rollins, the first mail since before the big storm, delivered by a writer who looked like he'd earned every cent of whatever he was being paid. Caleb was at the fence when Nora took it in, and when he came back, she was sitting at the table with the open letter in front of her, and her face had gone to the closed, careful expression he hadn't seen since December. He stopped in the doorway. "What is it?" She looked up. "It's from a man named Robert Whitaker," she said. "My brother." He came in and sat across from her. He waited. "I haven't spoken to him in 4 years," she said. We had a disagreement about the man I told you about, the one who left." She looked at the letter. "Robert told me at the time that I'd made poor choices, that I'd been too independent, too difficult, that I should have been more—" She pressed her lips together. "Accommodating. He thought if I'd been different, the man would have stayed." Caleb sat with that for a moment. "Was he right?" She looked at him sharply. "I'm not asking whether you should have changed," he said. "I'm asking whether he believed it, or whether he was saying it for another reason." The sharpness faded. She looked at the letter again. "He believed it," she said. "That's the thing. He wasn't cruel. He believed that women who had difficulty keeping men had caused it themselves. He was very certain about it." A pause. "I told him some things in response that were accurate but not kind, and then I left Ohio and didn't write. What does the letter say?" She pushed it across the table. He read it. It was a short letter written in the stiff, formal hand of a man who was not comfortable with vulnerability but was making an attempt. Robert Whitaker was getting married in April. He wanted his sister to know. He didn't ask her to come. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said, "I have thought about what you said. I don't know if I was wrong about all of it, but I think I was wrong about some of it. I hope you are well, wherever you are." Caleb set the letter down. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the fire burned down a little, and he didn't add wood because he didn't want the movement to interrupt whatever she was working through. "I don't know," she said finally, which was, from Nora, an enormous admission. She knew what she thought about almost everything. She processed fast and decided fast and rarely second-guessed. The things she didn't know were the things that lived in the complicated space between people, the things that couldn't be solved with a ledger or a supply plan. "He's not right," Caleb said, "about what he believed, about women and difficulty and what they owe men in exchange for being stayed with." She looked at him. "But I don't think that's actually what you're trying to decide," he said. She looked at the letter. "No," she said. "I'm trying to decide whether I want to have a brother." He had no answer for that. He didn't try to manufacture one. "That's yours to decide," he said. "Not mine." She nodded slowly. 3 days later, she wrote back. She didn't show him the letter, and he didn't ask. She sealed it and put it with the outgoing mail, and that was that. She didn't tell him what she'd said, and he didn't ask. And 2 months later, a short letter arrived with a return address from Columbus that she read at the table and then folded and put in the drawer of the writing table, the same drawer where Caleb kept things he didn't want to lose, without comment. He let it be. April arrived with mud and meltwater and the particular exhaustion of spring on the frontier, which was nothing like the rest it sounded like, and everything like the hardest physical work of the year compressed into 6 weeks. The snow came off the ridges all at once, it seemed, turning the creek into something that didn't look like the same body of water from December, and the mud season made every trip from the cabin to the barn an exercise in navigating terrain that seemed personally hostile to human movement. But the calves came. 3 more from the original herd, 2 healthy, one that needed 2 days of close attention and a great deal of effort from both of them before it found its footing. And Agnes's calf, who Nora had quietly named Clara without making an announcement about it, and who turned out to be exactly as difficult as Nora had predicted, and exactly as worth it. The kitchen garden went in the first week of April. Nora had ordered seeds through Pete Halverson's supply connection back in February, a forward-planning decision that Caleb hadn't known about until the packet arrived, and she laid it on the table with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who had assumed she was staying and had therefore planned accordingly. He'd stood looking at the seed packets, beans, squash, potatoes, and something he didn't recognize, and felt something move through him that took a moment to identify. It was the feeling of a future. Not just the abstract idea of a future, the way he'd told himself he was building towards something for 3 years without quite believing it, but a specific, detailed future that included seed packets ordered in February for planting in April, a woman who knew the name of every one of his remaining cattle, 2 names on a property deed, a drawer that held things neither of them wanted to lose. "What's this one?" he asked, holding up the unfamiliar packet. "Squash," she said. "Different variety. Clara Marsh used to grow it. I found a supplier in Denver who carries it." She didn't look up from the planning schedule she was writing. "You'll like it." He put the packet down. He looked at the top of her head, the dark hair, the way it fell when she wasn't paying attention to it. He thought about the train platform in December, the carpet bag that weighed almost nothing, the careful eyes assessing what he was and what this place was, and whether it was going to cost too much. He thought about the cost, what they'd both spent to get here, not just the last 4 months, but the years before. The accumulated quiet of his 3 years alone, the accumulated carefulness of her years of being too much for people who wanted less, the man who'd left, the boarding house that closed, the letters written and burned and written again. Nothing about any of it had been free. He thought sometimes, in the way that you thought about things in the early morning before the day's practicality took over, about what would have happened if the storm hadn't come. If she'd arrived in fine weather, dry roads, everything accessible, if there had been no blizzard to outlast together, no wolves, no midnight barn runs, no ankle that had forced a different kind of dependency than either of them would have chosen, would they have arrived here the same way? Would it have taken months longer, this careful unwinding of 2 people who had learned to hold themselves apart? He didn't know. He suspected the storm had done something that ordinary time might not have done, not made them into something they weren't. You couldn't force that, and the storm hadn't forced anything. It had only revealed. But it had accelerated the revelation, had stripped away the performance faster than comfort would have. You found out who people were under pressure. He'd known that about cattle and weather and broken equipment. He hadn't known he needed to learn it about himself, too. The fence rebuilding took most of April. Caleb worked section by section, the methodical progression that had always been his natural mode. Start at one end, work toward the other, don't skip ahead, don't assume. Nora came out to help for 2 hours each afternoon, once the ankle was fully reliable, and she was not as fast as him, but she was precise. And precise was more useful than fast on fence work, which rewarded care and punished rushing. They worked mostly in silence, the way people worked together who had gotten past the need to fill every moment with conversation. But it wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of people who had enough room with each other to just be present without explaining it. One afternoon in late April, restringing a long section of wire along the east boundary, Nora said, "Do you think the wolves will come back?" He kept working. "Some of them might. The pack moves, but we've established that we'll shoot back, which changes their calculation. Pete said he can get me that Winchester now. He sent a letter." Caleb looked over at her. "Did you write to Pete Halverson?" "I wrote to his wife," she said. "She's been managing their supply orders for 20 years. I figured she'd be the one to ask." He turned back to the fence wire. He was smiling, and he let it happen this time, all the way, without stopping it. "Get the rifle," he said. "I already told her yes," she said. He laughed, an actual, unguarded sound, not the carefully managed version he usually kept in reserve. It came out before he could think about it, and it surprised him. The sound of it in the open air above the valley, in the April light. Nora turned to look at him. She had an expression he'd never seen on her before. Pleased, slightly startled, like she'd discovered something she hadn't expected. She turned back to the fence wire quickly, but he'd seen it, and it sat warm in his chest for the rest of the afternoon. May came in green. That was the only word for it. Green the way people from the East Coast and the South didn't believe Wyoming could be. The way the land delivered after a brutal winter as if it owed you something and had decided to pay all at once. The creek ran full and clear, louder than it had been since he'd arrived 3 years ago. The cottonwoods along the bank came back in that particular pale, almost yellow-green of new growth. The grass in the south pasture came in thick, and the cattle moved through it like they'd been waiting all winter to remember what it was supposed to feel like. The kitchen garden went in green rows along the south side of the cabin. Nora worked it with the focused attention she gave everything, and Caleb helped when she asked and stayed out of it when she didn't. He understood now, after 5 months, which things were hers to manage and which were his and which were shared, and the sorting of that had happened mostly without discussion, organically, the way things sorted when two people paid attention to each other without either of them trying to take more than their share. The fence was done. The 3 new heifers had settled into the herd, 5 calves in total, the best spring crop the ranch had seen. The supply ledger for the first time showed a column where the income side was likely to exceed the expense side before the end of summer. Not by a lot, but by enough. One evening in late May, Caleb went to check on the cattle in the south pasture and found himself, at some point in the checking, just standing still at the top of the ridge above the valley and looking down at all of it. The ranch below him in the evening light, the cabin with smoke coming from the chimney, the green pasture with the herd moving through it, the kitchen garden in its rows, the rebuilt fence lines running off in 2 directions, straight and solid, the creek glittering through the cottonwoods, and Nora. He could see her from up here, a small figure moving between the garden and the cabin, carrying something, going about the evening in the unhurried way she moved now, different from December's careful efficiency. He stood up there for a while and let himself look at it. He had built this over 3 years in the particular isolated way of a man who believed that the doing was the point and the solitude was the cost, and that was the arrangement. And there was nothing wrong with what he'd built. It was real. It was solid. It was his. But it had been incomplete in a way he hadn't let himself understand until it was no longer incomplete. Like a room that was functional but had no window, and you didn't know you were missing the light until someone put the window in. He heard footsteps below and turned. Nora was coming up the ridge, not hurrying, moving with the assurance of someone who knew this land now, had walked it enough times to know where the ground was reliable and where it gave. She came up beside him and stood looking at the same view he'd been looking at. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She just looked. "Creek's higher than it's been," she said after a moment. "Snowmelt from the high ridges," he said. "It'll level off in June." "The lower pasture fence. I'll check it tomorrow," he said. "The post should hold, but I want to look at the east corner." She nodded. Then, after a moment, "It's good, what you built?" He looked at her. "What we built." She turned to look at him. The evening light was doing what it did to the valley this time of year. Everything softer, warmer, the hard lines of the winter landscape replaced by something more forgiving. Her face in it was different from December. Not unguarded. She would never be fully unguarded. That was not who she was. And he didn't need her to be. But open in the way that she'd become open with him by degrees over 5 months, like a country that had learned to trust carefully because that was the kind of trust that held. "What we built," she agreed. From somewhere down in the valley, below the tree line to the northwest, a wolf called, distant, a single note that rose and fell across the evening air. Not threatening, not close, just there, just the acknowledgement of something wild that was still out there. Still part of the country, still part of the calculation. Caleb moved toward the cabin, toward the rifle out of habit, the 3 years of lone vigilance kicking in automatically before he'd thought about it. And then Nora put her hand on his arm. Not gripping, not pulling him back. Just there. He stopped. He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at the valley below. The wolf had gone quiet. The cattle were still grazing, unbothered, the herd settling into the evening with the calm of animals that were fed and protected and had no immediate reason for alarm. He let his shoulders come down. They stood there on the ridge in the May evening, looking at what they had, and the wolf called once more from a long way off, and neither of them moved toward the cabin or away from the ridge or anywhere at all. They just stood there side by side, looking at the green valley below them and the mountains white and enormous to the southwest, and the creek bright through the cottonwoods, and the light coming down gold and level across all of it. Some people came to the frontier looking for escape. Some came looking for land or money or a clean start after something had ended. Some came because they had no other choice, and this was the last direction left. Caleb Mercer had come because he needed to find out if he was capable of building something that was truly his. Something that couldn't be taken from him because he'd made it himself, from scratch, from nothing but the land and his own labor and whatever character he'd developed in 31 years of living. He had found out. Nora Whitaker had come because she needed to find out if she was still capable of believing that something could be hers. Whether the accumulated losses, the man, the woman who had taught her, the job, the brother, the invisibility of a life spent making yourself smaller, had used up whatever was left of her capacity for that. She had found out. What neither of them had planned for, what neither had written in their letters, or said aloud or fully admitted even to themselves until it had already happened, was this: that the finding out was not a solitary process, that there were things you could not know about yourself until you were standing in a storm with someone, or sitting up through a dangerous night watching the rope line that led to where they were, or negotiating cattle prices with a stubborn Norwegian farmer while the person beside you drove the harder bargain. You found out what you were made of, and in finding that out, you found out what you were made of with someone specific, not in the abstract, not in the general, but with this one person who had also found out what they were made of, here, in this valley, in this winter. That was the thing. That was the entire thing. The light was nearly gone from the ridge when they went down. Nora's hand found his somewhere on the path, not dramatic, not announced, just the natural closure of a gap that had been narrowing for 5 months. He took it, and they walked back to the cabin that had 2 names on the deed, and a garden in green rows, and 5 calves in the south pasture, and a woodstack built the right way, and a drawer full of things neither of them wanted to lose. Inside, Soot was asleep in front of the fire with the absolute commitment of old dogs who had decided that warmth was the only remaining priority and intended to pursue it without apology. He didn't lift his head when they came in. His tail moved twice against the floor. Nora put water on for coffee. Caleb sat at the table and picked up the supply ledger and looked at the numbers that for the first time added up to something like enough. Outside, the valley settled into evening. The creek ran. The cattle grazed. The mountains held their place to the southwest, patient and enormous, unchanged by any human arrangement, but serving as witness to all of them. The wolf did not call again that night, but if it had, neither of them would have been afraid.